Let's get started. Rabbi Dr. Benzion Twerski, thank you so much for joining us. And I really appreciate it. I'm so maketov to your father, zt'l, and you tzalanga Yaron for all your help, for all you do for the community, and myself personally, mentoring me all these years and helping out. Your father was an extraordinary person, and there are so many facets to him, Dr. Twerski. And I guess I would love to hear what it was like growing up in his house first. What was it like having such an extraordinary human being as a parent, and as a child, and then later in life? Please, if we could just start there. To me, that's the most thing of interest.
First thing, Rabbi Yankee, is I take invitations from you with priority. So I'm not going to tell you that I would have skipped a grandchild's wedding to come on tonight, but I would have rearranged the schedule for just about anything else. Baruch Hashem, I was available, and I'm glad to be here. Our Yedidus goes back a very, very, very long way, and Baruch Hashem, there's relationships and friendships that never ever end, and they should continue.
Amen. Amen.
It's quite obvious that Klal Yisrael benefits a huge amount from Achdus. It made us eligible for Matan Torah. It's going to make us eligible for the Geula. Ve'eshev levavos albonim is an Achdus message, and as much as we can promote, the better off we are. It's an awesome task to try to encapsulate life with my father, and there's reasons that I have that are actually quite remarkable. You see, in one sense, he was a public figure. He was a trailblazer. He marched in full force into a whole bunch of areas that were taboo, that people tried to keep they tried to keep them quiet. He had books that were banned, and he had police escorts for a period of time because of threats. It was in the professional world. He did humongous amounts of things, and that was one part of his life. And that was a part of life that virtually thousands, if not many, many thousands of people were exposed to. He was not camera shy, so he was at any given moment. If he wasn't in the newspapers and the magazines, he was on television. He was on the radio. He was virtually everywhere. Aside from that, he had a completely different role when he was with family, and somebody would ask us, well, gee, did you walk around and hear all these quotes all the time? Now, I'm not going to tell you that we never heard some of the brilliant aphorisms from AA and recovery movements. We heard plenty of them, but when we heard them, they were not being used as slogans. They were being used as parts of life that he just incorporated. He told us often that, well, he was not alcoholic, and there was no drinking going on, and there were no pills going on. He would pick up and go to AA meetings frequently just for himself. It gave him messages of being able to look at himself critically and not be afraid to make some discoveries of what was going on the inside. a little
I
over.
want to, Reverend Sina, I just want to, Dr. Twerski, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. He went to AA meetings because he wanted to
get some recovery messages that are useful to every man, woman, and child, regardless of whether they ever touched a drop of alcohol or a drug in their entire life. If there was a way of making in a 12-step meeting understandable to a newborn infant, he would have newborns going there. Why not?
Arnie's laughing. Thank you, Arnie.
Arnie,
he did. He would. He would.
Listen, Arnie, I'm going to tell a little vignette of something. You actually know probably many of the players there, but here was something that happened. I was living in Pittsburgh. This is some number of years after I was married, and there was one of the fellows who had gone through rehab in Pittsburgh. This was his second rehab for addiction to cocaine. What had happened the first time around, I don't know where he had done the rehab, it was not in Pittsburgh. And when he came out of rehab, he stayed sober for a year. And on his 1-year anniversary of sobriety, he celebrated. So of course he went right back into the full-blown addiction. And this time when he came into rehab, he came to Pittsburgh. Now, during the month of being a resident at Gateway Rehab, my parents had gone to Eretz Yisrael for a couple of weeks. So they were calling me with some of the shilas, like, is he allowed to do writing homework on Shabbos? I said, nope, but he can do it Friday. He can do it Matzah Shabbos. He said that he can't go to the meetings on Shabbos because he would be taking the elevator and he can't go down. And I said, don't you guys know the answer to that? The way to get to recovery is to take the steps.
Take the steps.
Anyway,
I know the story.
Well, there's more coming. What happened was that...
Dr. Twerski, can I just stop you for a second, Rabbi Benzion? When you said that he went to AA meetings just for his own personal growth, is that my understanding of what you're saying?
Correct.
So you reminded me of something. I once asked your father, and I asked your father, zt'l, I said, Reb Shia, how do people in recovery change? It was during Elul, a week before Rosh Hashanah or so. I said, I go into shul every year, and I really, really think I really feel that I want to become better and improve whatever I'm looking to improve upon. And a week later, I'm doing the same thing. So how do people in recovery manage it? And I can't. And I guess you wouldn't be surprised. It was shocking to me. He said, Rabbi Yankee, you have to decide that you don't want to live the way you are. He said, you don't really want to change. He said, when you decide that you don't want to live this way and you want to change your life and it's existential for you, and if you go to a tshuva meeting for 40 days straight, he said, if you went to a meeting and talked about whatever you wanted to improve, you would also be able to do it. That's what he told me, like on the spot.
Just as a reference to take a look at, the Pesesner of Kleinimus Kalman has a little cipher that he wrote, which is absolutely fascinating, called B'nai Machshava Tova. And in this B'nai Machshava Tova, he actually proposes a Musar group, a support group for people who are interested in self-improvement. There's rules to the group. There's the group process, and he details it, and it's just staggering how fantastic a program he designed. I mean, he didn't survive to be able to put it into action, but he actually described It would be the equivalent of a 12-step meeting with a focus purely on Musar. You should take a look at it. In any case,
How did your father get involved in this space altogether?
it's interesting because what happened was that when he became the director of psychiatry at St. Francis, it was a huge psychiatric department. I can't remember the number of beds, but there was nothing in the entire state that size for a psychiatric hospital. And they had their own building. Now, it happened to have been an old dilapidated building that richly deserved to be replaced and eventually was. But let's put it this way. They had elevators with an elevator operator in it, where there were these two doors that would open and shut. It was just very interesting. Anyway, he wound up being the attending for the detox unit. And he was detoxing approximately 1,000 people a year. Except that of the 1,000 people that he was detoxing, mostly alcohol, there was a number of drugs coming into the picture then. Cocaine did not exist in those years. Of the 1,000 people, more than half of them were coming in repeatedly. So that he's detoxing the same person in June that he did in January. What's going on? And it was clear that there was no follow-up. Well, what is it going to take for somebody to actually get sober and stay sober? And in his incursion, one of the people that he met had been sober for a period of several years. And he said, listen, I can't get people to stay sober for more than a couple of months. What are you doing? I go to meetings. He says, what meetings? Well, Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, you know what? Let me check him out. And he began going to meetings and learning what it was that the focus was. In an AA meeting, you don't sit there and talk about alcohol. Those are called drunkalogs, and there's no purpose in doing that. People can do that without going to meetings. The purpose of going to the meetings is to talk about sobriety. And if somebody's experiencing difficulty and challenges with it, that's what they talk about. They talk about their triggers. They talk about what kind of influences get them to go in and out of these kinds of behaviors. They talk about the escape from all these internal experiences that they find it difficult to live with. Look,
So
we medicate things.
So your father felt that doing the detox work was frustrating because he kept seeing the recidivism. So he said he wanted to get into the other end. In other words, is that correct?
Correct.
And he when did he open? I think he opened in the 1971.
Gateway opened in 1971.
71. That was in Pittsburgh.
In Pittsburgh. And he had started as director of psychiatry in September of 65. So he was, as he began to learn more, the wisdom that you get from the experience of recovering people, and in the rooms of AA, which have been open since 1930, you're getting the cumulative wisdom of thousands of people who have made the discoveries not by doing research, but by, I guess if you talk scientific lingo, there's an N of one. People are studying from their own experience and they share it with others. And I would much rather be able to learn from somebody else's experience rather than from my own. Now, experience is still the best teacher. We all know that. And here, by pooling their collective experience, the ability to learn from that is immense. So that what my father discovered is that there's wisdom over here that some of the greatest philosophers and the greatest psychologists and the greatest thinkers have not been able to codify.
And was that a trailblazing idea at the time? Because I think Was
AA
that
was not a new idea because it had
right?
been
I don't mean
functioning
AA.
solidly since 1930, and rehabs were not new either. But there was nothing available in the area near Pittsburgh at the time. And one of the things that made a humongous mark was the fact that because he was there, the addiction issues coming up in the Jewish community in many places all began to point towards him. And this is where, in the 1960s, Shikar is a guy. If you see an alcoholic, you can probably make a safe bet this person is not Jewish. Now, Isaac Trainin, who was a rabbi in the 60s, made a very interesting observation. In the earlier years, there were efforts to try to get hotels to incorporate into their design the ability to hold affairs that were kosher, whether it's dinners or weddings or other kinds of events. And most hotels were not interested. Now, here you had the kashrus organizations approaching these major hotels, saying we want to be able to have kosher affairs over here. These are some of the needs that we would have, yada yada yada. The hotels were basically not interested because the main income that they were getting percentage-wise.
I see what you're getting now.
From the bar.
Yeah, from the bar.
And approximately 1962 or 63, the hotels began coming to the kashrus organization saying, we want kosher affairs here because now we see the Jews drink just like everybody else. So this is the early 60s.
Wow.
Now, I would venture to believe that this was not commonly recognized within the Torah community. Maybe there were some little pockets where this was seen, but this was something that was not that was otherwise not noticed well. And I will tell you that our population was considerably smaller then than it is now, and I would also venture to believe that percentage-wise, things were not on the same scale as they are today. They were
I think it's. I
considerably
can't
lower.
say for sure, but it seems to me that it's increasing. Yes.
There's an increase in how accepting we are of both the behavior as well as the treatment, where there's a reduction to some degree of the stigma. But what I want to go back to is the story that I began to tell it to relate before. But this fellow who came through rehab in Pittsburgh, and here when he got to his first anniversary, my parents said, "We're making the party. The party is going to be at our house." And of course, it's a completely dry party, so that there's plenty to drink, but none of it has any alcohol in it. And there was a ton of food, and there were a lot of people that were there from the community. The people who knew that this fellow was in recovery, they came. They were invited. There were a lot of the from recovering people who had either been through the rehab there or had otherwise had connections. They were there. There must have been well over 100 people mulling around in my parents' house. Now, what's interesting is that in that house, when you come inside, there's the living room, there's the dining room, there's a kitchen, and there's the steps to go upstairs. There's no bathroom on the first floor.
Okay.
So some of these from recovering people had been guests at my father's Shabbos table more than once. And when the guests come in, they're notified, bathrooms upstairs, take the steps straight up, go directly in front of the steps, opposite the steps. So somewhere in the middle of the party, one of these people goes upstairs and comes down, and they're giggling their heads off, right? One by one. What are you laughing about? You've been here a while, you're partaking of the festivities. nature's bound to call. Go use the bathroom. Nobody, I think 8 people went upstairs and came down and could not control their laughter.
And neither can Arnie. Neither can Arnie right now. I think you've heard this one before.
Not only that, I stole it and I used to do it too.
Okay, so here's what happened.
I don't know the
Somebody
story.
finally
Arnie.
blurted out the secret. What would you expect a recovering addict to do? They're visiting in your home, total stranger, and they go and they use the bathroom. After they've taken care of nature's call,
They can
what
look for
do they do?
medication or anything. with
Exactly.
alcohol.
Scotch tape on a piece of paper inside the medicine cabinet was a sign that says, "Some things never change."
Your father put that in.
Yeah. I never said a word to anybody. Nobody knew about this. And
That
what was,
hysterical.
what was so relevant about this is that working with them so much and so intensely for such an amount of time, he learned how they think. He was able to put himself into their shoes, and he could predict how they would think. Maybe prediction is never 100% accurate, but he was pretty close. And it made a difference because now that they see that he understands them, now they can connect, now they can relate. And it was just
Can I ask you? I'm sorry, go ahead.
It was just amazing watching this, because he was so eager to learn whatever he could from them, and he did. And this is where, like, walking down the street with him on Shabbos, we moved in with my family over Shabbos, walking to and from shul. It was not unusual for a car to just stop in the middle of the street. We had garbage trucks stop in the middle. So we had police cars stop in the middle. And somebody would jump out of the car and say, "Hi, Dr. Twerski, thanks. I've got 8 years now."
Wow.
And this was commonplace. After we moved out of town, my sister lived there with her kids, and the kids were relating. This was a daily affair. That people would just stop. "Hi, I got 15 years.
Amazing.
This was somebody who made a mark. Yes, we can look at this in a global way. Look what he did. He created this rehab from scratch. How many? He put certain problems on the map. So domestic violence is on the map.
Yeah.
PMS is on the map, and several other things. Eating disorders is on the map. These things were dear to his heart because he saw them as areas that had been neglected or just passed over, and it was high time that somebody should address them in a very useful way. And he just like a Sherman tank, just went right in and did it. Where do you get the money to put up an inpatient facility with 90 beds? Well, one of the places he started were some of the major corporations. So he had U.S. Steel and J&L Steel, 2 huge steel companies that are confined to the archives of history today. Huge steel corporations. He went into them.
He went on his own. He just went in there
on his own. He went as far up to the top as he could, and he said, "Listen, to whoever the corporate presidents were, I'm going to tell you how many of your employees I had to detox with in the last 2 years. How would you like to help them for real, so you can get them to come back to you and work in an honest capacity?"
And they ponied up. They gave him money for
They forked over a fortune.
Wow. He was so real, and he was so real that I could imagine. I could kind of see him doing this, just walking into someone's office and he had such a gift of communicating with people. I was online on social media after he was niftar, after he passed away, and the tributes that came in, from people all around the world, a very large percentage, not Jewish or not religious, and the depth of gratitude that they had and how they all felt, so close to him. It was really, it's just a rumor. How did he do it? How was he able to give a little piece of himself to so many people? You had a front row seat. I know what I saw. We all know what we saw in different ways. You had a front row seat. How did he have the ability? These are my questions. How did he have ability to take a phone call or communicate with people who called him, including Yankee Horowitz, including myself? When I started Project Yes in 1996, I called him numerous times. I didn't know anything about addiction or any of these things. How did he have the time, and how did he manage to have thousands of people think that they were his favorite patient? Like that he had a place in his heart, especially for them. That's what I heard from survivors, from people in recovery. They all felt that. They felt that he had this place for them. I have no other way of describing it. How do you do it?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer because I don't, there's a, if you have a 2-quart pot, you can fit 2 quarts into it. You can't fit 15. I don't know how that happens. I do know that he applied himself to whatever he was doing with totality. When he was davening, he was davening. When he was learning, he was learning. When he was working, he was working. When he was taking charge of helping somebody restore their life and their dignity and their sobriety, their health, he applied himself to that 100%. I sit back and I wonder where he developed the tolerance that he had, because early on, working with some of these people, you work with people that are in a state of obnoxiousness that's sometimes remarkable. In my last year living in Pittsburgh, before I moved to New York, there was a fellow that had gone through Rehab. He was my age. He was in a different yeshiva, but some of my grade school classmates were classmates of his. And he got out of rehab, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and he came to daven with us. I cannot tell you how painful of an experience that was. He was nuts. He was, I'm not gonna say obscene, he was obnoxious, he was loud, he was boisterous, he was irritating. And you watched over time, over the months that followed, how he began to tame down. Granted, he had 4 weeks of sobriety when I met him, and that was sobriety in a controlled environment. And he gradually began to settle down and become much more normal, I guess, the way he was before he began to put all this garbage into his brain. And he actually turned into a really, really nice guy, which is probably what he was beforehand. And maybe there's a couple of character traits that he had worked on in the.
And you're saying that your father was tolerant of where he was at the time?
That's right. And I found myself, I didn't do it because he was sitting in shul, like at the same table with me. I had nowhere to go anyways. And I just basically sort of bit my tongue and davened, and I behaved. But my father had full tolerance. He could have easily invited him over for any of the meals. I don't know if he did or he did not. He could have easily done it. And I don't know how. I don't know how.
I don't know how he had the tolerance.
Had the tolerance. Look, in the office, it's one thing. That's what the work is. When you're in shul and you're at home and at your own dining room table, it's a different environment. There's different rules that are in place to maintain that. And he had immense tolerance. One of the things
And can I ask you that, if I can just stay there, because we kind of started there. What was he like at home?
it's very interesting.
Was he able to shut it off? I mean, I'm just curious.
At home, he was a father like any other father. We used to go to the park to play ball on Sundays. We would go to the park. He would spend time with us. He would play games at home. We spent time together. And it's not like, his Sundays were work free. There was no such thing as as a day being work free. But there was tremendous amount of together time that we had. There were times that I used to get up with him at 6 o'clock in the morning and we would learn. Then I would go to shul with him. And I remember, going to the old Chavetz Chaim shul that hasn't existed in decades. They started davening way before Alois Shachar. People would put on Taliesin film. You had to make the brocha later.
Right.
That's how early he had to. That's how early he had to do it. And he never came to davening late. When he davened, he davened. There was no such thing as cell phones then, anyways. But had there been such a thing, it would not have been part of his life then. What's a cell phone doing in shul? He was not. If he would be an emergency doctor on call, he would have carried something with him, but he wasn't. So when he davened, he davened. I would sometimes hear comments from him. You see that man over there? He's davening. Watch how he davens. And he turned me on to just looking at some very, very simple people who were davening with the kind of sincerity that I aspire to Yom Kippur. It just grabbed me, and it's like, can I get close to that?
Dr. Twerski, forgive me if I'm being bold. He was so far ahead of his time. You know it better than anyone else. How did he deal with the frustration of people around him not seeing things the way he did? Like I can't imagine, the things that you and I started saying in 1990, he was saying in 1970. I wonder what that was like. Did you ever discuss this with him?
We've had conversations that touched on that. And he says, listen, I have to do my thing, whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to do to enable this to work. That's up to him. I have my share of what I have to do. And he took that seriously. There was a fellow who had done his rehab in Pittsburgh for alcohol. He's somebody from the area that's local to where I live now. I cannot remember any, not that I'd be sharing confidential information. I can't even remember the fellow's name. And he had sobered up, and my father would call him every couple of days to find out, hey, how you doing? And he was going to meetings and he was doing what he had to. Then my father invited him for Rosh Hashanah to come to Pittsburgh. Now, because of the Yontif schedule, we moved into my parents' house. So we saw him in the room that he was sleeping in. It was once my room, many years ago. And Rosh Hashanah was Shabbos that year, the first day. And we went to Shul, Rosh Hashanah at night. it was wonderful. And we came home and we ate. And Rosh Hashanah by day, the first day Yontif, my father had davened Shachris for the Omid. And during Musaf, my father turns to me and he says, he's not here. Run home and see where he is.
That person was a guest in your house?
Yes, yes. I went home and I went upstairs and I pushed open the door a little bit and there he is sleeping. Okay, came back, told my father, he's there, he's sleeping. He says, okay. We came home from shul. And my father walked upstairs and he opened the door. He didn't wake him. He walked directly over to the suitcase, pulled out a bottle of Southern Comfort, and then he woke him up. And he said, listen, this is a little bit bizarre. It's Rosh Hashanah. It's Shabbos. You're coming to me to be able to get chizik to be sober. And you bring this along. And he was obviously, he wasn't sleeping. He was passed out.
Right.
My father told him, go downstairs with your suitcase, take a taxi, go back to the airport and go home. Rosh Hashanah and Shabbos.
Wow.
My father was confirmed in his conviction here, and he did it. And for weeks and weeks later, my father was saying, I know I did the right thing, but it just doesn't feel right. I feel bad about it. Now, a while later.
But which part of it, that he sent them away?
On Shabbos and on Yontif.
Right.
With all the Chil Shabbos and Chil Yontif and on Rosh Hashanah.
And you think he did it to send a message to him that it's existential and you got to get your act together?
Yeah.
Right.
What you're doing is as bad as doing this. You may as well do that. And he felt awful. Several years later, I'm living in Borough Park. I have somebody calls me for a consult. And they come into the office and they sit down and they said, you know our family. I said, who's your family? So-and-so is my brother. I said, oh, how's he doing? He says, he's doing great. He's sober as they come, in recovery, doing everything he has to do right. I said, that's terrific. Would he be willing to talk to me? I'd love to hear from him. They said, what do you want to talk to him about what happened that year, Rosh Hashanah? I said, I'm really curious. What was his takeaway from that? And they said, we're going to tell you what he said. We'll tell him to call you to share it so you hear it directly from him. That was one of the most important events of his life. And he owes his recovery to that experience. And it was literally that's
what he shared with you. That's what he shared with you.
Yes. It literally was the most important experience in his life. This made him get sober and stay sober. And he has a life, and he married, and he has a family, and he's probably got grandchildren by now. And it put his life.
Did your father ever find out about that?
Yes. As soon as that happened, I called him and I shared it. He asked me to.
I once asked your father. I told him that I wanted to go into writing. I just wanted to do some writing op-ed pieces and other things like that. And I asked him, Dr. Twerski, what do I need to know? Like, any tips? By the time he probably had written 50 books or so. How many did he write totally? 80? How many did he write in his lifetime?
The last one that came out posthumously said that it was the 90th book.
Unbelievable. And he lived 90 years. Wow. A book a year. So I asked him, I said, what do I need what do you recommend I do? I will never forget his answer as long as I live. He looked at me, he had this way of patting you on the hand,
Mm-hmm.
I still miss it. So he said, Rabbi Yaakov, get used to rejection. That's what he said right away. He said, get used to rejection. Did you ever hear anything like that from him? I'm just curious.
Yes.
I imagine that's something that if he told it to me, I imagine he lived it. He said, get used to rejection. My first manuscript was rejected by, I think, 37, I think he said, something publishers. So he said, get used to rejection. If you want to do something, he said, just keep doing it and don't give up if that's what you feel you want to do. I just, it was his humility and his, the way he was so practical was just extraordinary. Was there more to that story that I didn't know?
No, I mean, the probably one of the most remarkable stories, and it was actually written up and published by Pesach Krohn in one of his Maggid books. I think Echoes of the Maggid has a story. I was part of it, but it had to do with a fellow in Pittsburgh who was a single guy, about tshuva, very, very decent, nice kid, nice fellow. He wasn't a kid anymore, and he had a rotation of where he would eat his Shabbos meals. Everybody loved him. So he was, by title bums and balls, and milches, and part of the circuit was at my parents' house. And one of the times that he was there, my father was telling stories, that he had, he was makabel, and he heard from my Zayda and from his father, and when he would share a story, he would invariably bring out an insight that comes from the story. So this is not just interesting stories because they were dramatic or something cataclysmic happened. It was not about that. It was like, well, what do we learn from it? At some point in the conversation, he said to this fellow, he said, Brad, I had an uncle Nochem. I say that an older brother, Nochem, who lived in Eretz Yisrael. I do remember this Uncle Nochem. Uncle Nochem was a treasure of stories and vertlich. And being 9 years older than my Zayda, he remembered a ton of them. And what happened was that Uncle Nochem put very little down in writing. He wrote a sefer of Yuchsin, and there's like one-page bios on several of the Zaydas with a couple of stories in it, and that's it. And anybody who knew Uncle Nochem knew, come with a tape recorder, start him talking and turn it on and just let it go.
Because he's not going to write it down. That's what you mean.
So he says, I have a taina on my Uncle Nochem. I'm really upset. The man had treasures and treasures and treasures, and he can find so little to writing. And this fellow looks at my father and he says, and what makes you any better? And
Whoa.
My father says, touche, you got me. And starting Matzai Shabbos, he grabbed one of these big.
What do you mean, until then he hadn't written anything?
Nothing for the Judaica market. He had written 5 books for the lay secular market.
Well, that book that he wrote with the comics, with the
much later.
Charlie Brown.
Much later. So
how in the world did he get to Schultz?
He went through the publisher. The publisher made that connection because he began to read things in there and he says, wow, whoever did this has tremendous insight. And Schultz never even believed that he had that kind of insight. That was the interesting thing.
For those who don't know, how many books did he write? A few, 2 or 3? How many were there?
3 that concentrated only on peanut strips. And there was another 2 books, I believe, that had peppered around several others, including peanuts.
Right. So for those who don't know, Dr. Twerski analyzed the cartoons cartoons is the right word, comics.
Yeah, the comics.
The comic strips of back in the day, they would a comic strip, like it had a few pictures, images there, and a narrative. So he would psychoanalyze what lessons, what lessons can be learned from that. And what an idea.
Great lines.
I'm sorry?
So here,
So he
this
started
fellow-
writing Jewish books when someone
Right.
someone told him off politely.
Hold them up, like,
He told him off
okay.
politely, and your father.
So he wrote generation to generation. It took a couple of years before he wrote the next book for the Jewish market. Then what happened was interesting. I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, and my office was listed together with my father's name. So my father used the office maybe 2 or 3 times. That was the office that I would be working from for my private practice. And I get a phone call at home from a psychologist whose office was next door to mine. And what was her name? I can't remember her name anymore. She calls me and she says, "There's a woman here in your office looking for you." So I said, "Put her on the phone." This woman introduces herself to me. She says, "My name is Joanne. I live in Los Angeles. I was at a convention in Atlantic City. I flew in and out from the Philadelphia airport. My return flight to LA changes planes in Pittsburgh. And the airport in Philadelphia was fogged in. So we left late and I missed my connecting flight." My rabbi says,
So she was stuck in Pittsburgh.
Stuck in Pittsburgh. So her son was at the rabbi's house and he was fine. He was taken care of. But here she's stranded. So she says, the rabbi said, "Do you know anybody in Pittsburgh?" She says, "No, but I'm in the middle of reading Generation to Generation. And I really like the book. And it says that Rabbi Twerski lives in Pittsburgh. Maybe I can be a guest by him for Yontif." This is Erev Shavuos. Sure enough, I got the call, so I went. I picked her up. Now I was moving into my parents' house with my family, which I don't remember if it was 6 kids, 7 kids, 8 kids. I don't know what it was then. Whatever it is, it was a sizable family, and my kids were in sleeping bags on the living room floor. Besides filling all the bedrooms, so we couldn't have given her a place to sleep, but the community of Pittsburgh is a very, very warm, welcoming community, and we had her placed quite quickly, no problem. So she's coming out of shul the first day Shavuos, and she says, she greets me, "Is your father coming?" "Yeah, he's making his way out. I have to say good Yontif to him." Okay, so she did. She says, "Rabbi Twerski, I knew as soon as I was able to locate you and your name in the phone book and your son, Baruch Hashem, I'm all taken care of." And he says to her, "You're our guest today, you know that." And she came. Now, it was this fellow's rotation to eat at my parents' house, first day Yontif. And these 2 single people met over my parents' dining room table. They had their first date with Motzei Yontif, and they're married for quite some time. This is a couple that in the snowy conditions when we were sitting Shiva, they drove from Pittsburgh to be Menachem Ovel.
Wow.
They did not do the phone thing. They drove all the way from Pittsburgh. This is, this Baruch Hashem, it's a beautiful family, and their shidduch was made by the coincidence. The book was written because of him. The book attracted her to come to our house, and that was their shidduch. So if anybody needs a shidduch, get somebody to write a book for you.
You once told me, your father once told me that he has this simanim of an addict when it comes to writing. I don't know if you ever heard that. We were talking about, I asked him to define addiction. And he was this, I asked him, so what's the difference? How can you tell if somebody, feels that they have a need to drink? Let me ask you, how would you describe addiction, Rabbi Benzion? If it's somebody that does a lot of drinking, it's why. How would you define addiction, please?
Well, let's put it this way: you can easily identify things that we do habitually every single day. That if we were not to do it, we would not feel right. Okay, so most people I know to get
That's the
up.
definition.
Well, think about it for a second. Most people I know get up in the morning and they go to the bathroom. You want to see what happens if you get up in the morning and you don't go to the bathroom, right? It's not going to take terribly long before the discomfort's going to set in. You cannot tell me that this is withdrawal symptoms, because the process that we're dealing with is something that's biologically necessary. But when you have something that A, is not biologically necessary, B, is it leads you to negative consequences, all right? Taking care of, responding to your bodily needs does not result in negative consequences.
Okay.
Drinking does, drugging does, compulsive gambling does, etc. So when we're talking about, and really the only thing that makes an addict wise up and say, hey, I need some help, I got to change, is where they encounter negative consequences. Which is one of the reasons why we have the challenge of doing interventions when somebody is unwilling. Then you have to mobilize, a bunch of things in the environment to be able to make that into something which is possible by bringing the bottom up and bringing about the negative consequences. But that which is a challenge.
I so much appreciate your time, Dr. Twerski, and I really appreciate sharing the personal side. What was the reason behind your father's funeral? Was just, it was so out of the box, and it was, for those who don't know, I believe that was a song that your father wrote. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he wrote in this tzava. He told his kids that he told you kids that that's what he wants.
He told us all about it verbally. It was in the tzava that was written down, and there were actually two things that had alerted him.
I'm sorry, I didn't explain it to the folks who don't know. Rather he did no hespedim. Is that correct?
What?
There were no hespedim. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes, so there were no eulogies, and I think instead he said on the way to the burial,
he had them escorting him to the burial. He had them singing the song that he had written in 1960 for my uncle's weddings. This was his song that he composed in 1960.
I didn't know that, by the way, until the funeral.
Yeah, and there were two things that triggered him to that. He was in Eretz Yisrael at the time that Shlomo Carlebach passed away, and he was, I don't know if he participated in the Levaya because it was rather lengthy, but at some part of it he was there, and he heard them singing one or more of his of Shlomo's tunes, but he was an avid collector and reader of Sipurei Tzadikim, and in one of the stories that he had read and included it in one or more of his books was a story of a Moshe Leib Sassover who had been at a wedding or a simcha, and there was music, and there was one particular tune that they were playing, and he said, I like that tune so much that I would like this tune to be played at my funeral.
Wow.
Now, what did happen was that he lived quite a number of years later.
Who was Moshe Leib Sassover?
The Moshe Leib Sassover. And when it came time for his funeral, nobody was remembering that tzava that he had given. It was so many years. It was so many years back. And while they're on their way to his burial site, there was passing by. There was a procession of a wedding, and the band was playing that music. for that particular tune. And somebody there remembered and says, "Whoa, Moshe Leib asked for this."
That's what he
They
wanted.
brought the band over and they played the music in front of him exactly as he asked that it be done. And my father was very impressed with that. Now, what he said when he talked to us about it is that this tune was popularized almost, maybe it took a year before it became world
Everywhere.
everywhere. There's no facet of the community that was not familiar with it. In Lubavitch at the Fabrengens, it was a staple, and there's countless clips of this all over the World Wide Web. He says, "I brought simcha." He says, "I don't know what other schusim I have, but here I know that I brought simcha to people, and I'd like that schus to escort me."
Oh, like he had a shortage of others.
Correct.
Yeah, like he had a shortage of others.
This is what's awesome is that we're always looking at this as, there's boots that we have to fill, and it's amazingly difficult to fill a pair of boots like this.
Yeah.
I'm the only member of the family to go into the mental health field, and I obviously derived in that sense a lot of things that my siblings did not, just because their focus was very different. But we spent humongous amounts of time. I lived back in Pittsburgh with after I was married for another 10 years. So I really got to nosh a lot, and there was so much there. I mean, one of the things that always leaves us with our mouths agape is he was multi-talented. I remember when we were little kids, how he used to make Mishenichnas other signs. Elmer's glue, glitter. He would do the lettering freehand. I didn't know that he could draw, but he could. He didn't do a lot of it, but he could. That he davened for the Omid, that he was about Tekeya and about Kargan, and he mastered many of these things. The Freiliche Tisha B'Av that Remmel Fried put on one of his CDs was just one micro sample of the kind of writing that he did for that. There are pieces that he wrote that have never really been published.
Pieces, articles or music?
Well, music a lot, but there were articles. I mean, I have a manuscript of his that's called "When Truth Finally Came to the White House." And he describes something that was it was an event that was, it was all over. There was a series of events all over the secular media, the various politicians, falling into disgrace because they were dishonest and they were involved in who knows what. And he had this fantasy of how the population grew extremely untrusting of politicians. And now we got a problem because we have to be able to have people run for office who have some degree of honesty.
Yep.
So after bringing this to the upper echelons of the government, they decided to run some studies to identify who we can count on that will be impeccably honest. And they ran the studies and they ran the data multiple times until they finally came out identifying one group of people. And this is the only one they could identify that have any shaykhs at all to impeccable, brutal honesty.
And who was that?
Alcoholics in recovery.
Alcoholics in recovery.
So they contacted AA World Services and they said, listen, we need two
Somebody
candidates
to run for office.
to run for office. We need a Republican, we need a Democrat. So, they AA had to have a meeting because they don't get involved in politics. They finally gave them Alphonse, who was a Republican, who was a farmer from Oklahoma, and Zachary, who was a woodcutter from Montana. And they go running for office, and of course, all their campaign speeches are held in church basements. The campaign fundraisers is passing around the bucket.
Bucket.
And,
Oh, did they win?
huh?
Did they win?
These two guys, the only thing that they differed about in terms of policy was where is the first place you go to ban alcohol and make sure that everybody stays sober?
Yeah.
In the military or in Congress? And that's where they were having a really hard time with. But,
No, I was at a recovery retreat. I was invited to Invoke a couple of years ago. And I came home, one of my friends said, "What's it like there?" I said, it was impactful in so many ways, but like you're in a room with a bunch of people who are completely truthful. And they're not, it's really, that they're not hiding any of the things that we all hide, that our warts, that they're open about it. It was an incredible experience. Dr. Twerski, I am so grateful for your time. May I be so bold? And maybe I can be the one to encourage you to write the things that your father left for you.
Go for it. Go for
Dr.
Twerski.
Arnie, you saw my manuscript, didn't you?
it.
Dr. Twerski, think about it. You were left an incredible gift. Think about sharing it.
Okay. All right.
I really deeply appreciate your time. Your father was such an extraordinary person. His neshama should have an aliyah, and he should be a git debater for your entire extended family and all the people that he touched so deeply. Thank you so very much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
As incredibly
Enjoy this.
uplifting as I did. Thank you so much. Be well, everybody. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Twerski. Good night, everyone. Be well.
Good night, everybody.
Mati, how are you, Mati?